a lot of the things that organizations bring up in conversations, whether it's through the team at FloridaMakes, the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity, third-party providers, the defense industrial base at large, I heard that something was going to be changing in the regulatory landscape. How do we deal with that? Should we take action now? Should we wait for the change to come? What are some of the things that are worth working on now, or things that we should prioritize for later? So for this session, really what we want to get into is how do I deal with scenarios where the regulations themselves change or shift, and we want to bring forward some practical examples of that. So for the next two segments that we're going to be going through, our goal is to unpack and walk through all of the things that were added in the CMMC model as we see it today, that are new when compared to our existing regulatory obligations we've had since 2016, and then walk through the process of what happens if these things change, so that we can understand where to invest or not invest our time and effort. So effectively, the thought experiment we're gonna run through is, if CMMC as it exists today goes away tomorrow, what would the impact be on all of our effective organizations? Now, the reason that we're saying that something like CMMC could change or somehow cease to be is probably not the most likely outcome that would exist, but we should just be aware of the fact that things like the cybersecurity maturity model certification are dependent on what exists from existing regulations and rulemaking and congressional approval and all these other things that underpin or support any of these regulatory models. So the CMMC program as it stands today, it's a fledgling effort, and therefore it's subject to things like National Defense Authorization Act approval. The NDAA requires that the DoD has a verification and assessment method for contractors' ability to safeguard CUI. And we have Information Security Oversight Office, or ISU guidance, stating exactly what kinds of assessment rigor have to be applied when assessing an organization. But there's nothing that says it needs to be named CMMC or it needs to be an accreditation body that performs the work or anything like that. Those are constructs that were built around the assessment and verification requirement put forth by Congress. So right now we've got a DFARS contract clause, the 7021 clause we talked about this morning. That clause is an interim rule, and so this year's DFARS rulemaking session could always change or edit or tweak some of the language that's in those clause, the clause language itself, or something even more drastic could happen or change. So what we would want to do here is to use the old axiom, sort of hope for the best, plan for the worst. If there's huge, largely impacting changes, what can we do now that isn't going to be redundant work or unnecessary if there ever was a change? I hear a lot of people talking in the defense contracting space, not necessarily the regulatory space, because regulators understand that there are set processes you have to go through to effect change. But I hear a lot of defense contractors saying something like, I heard CMMC was delayed. I heard CMMC was canceled. I heard they're not doing that anymore. And usually when you ask them, how did you hear about that? Or can you tell me more about that position? They don't usually have a lot of information behind it. They just heard something. And so what we would want to look at in these cases is if for some reason there was going to be a change to the model, what were we already required to do and perform? So if we dig into this, I'm sure that all of you have been through countless presentations and webinars where someone has walked you through, well, the CMMC model is this thing and it's that thing. Here at the end of the day is what we're dealing with. The CMMC model itself is split into two unique topics. We've got processes, from which we get the requirements for process maturity, and we have practices. They come from different places. They have different roles in the model. What we need to understand is if either of these sides of the coin were to change, what should we do to make sure that any implementations we do today aren't overscoped or chasing something that isn't going to be a target tomorrow. So within the CMMC model itself, on the processes side, we have these 3 levels of process maturity. The 3 that we're really interested in are the first 3 for almost every organization we talk with. Level 1, are you doing the things that are listed on the practice side? Are you just doing them? Doesn't matter how sophisticated or robust your implementation is, are you just performing the work? Is it being done? Level 2 is whether or not it's actually written down in a way that can be measured against, that can be assessed against. That has to do with both policy and procedure. And then level 3, which is managed, has this concept of resource plans around it, which is when we look at all the practices that need to be performed, do I have strategic plans in place? Have I assigned specific people? Do I know how much it's going to cost? All of these other things. Now, on the practice side, we're mostly just inheriting our existing contractual obligations, which is to implement the 110 safeguarding requirements in NIST 800-171. Now, in addition to that, there have been these 20 additional practices added on, and we're going to walk through each one of those in these next 2 modules to look at why they exist and what would happen if there was a change to those. But for the most part, we're on a solid bedrock of things that are already written into NIST standards, that are already required in contract language. So those are here to stay. If the NIST 800-171 model itself doesn't change under the FSMA program, those don't change either. So there is a dependency there that isn't going anywhere. So when we get into this model, the first thing we're going to do is walk through process maturity, what it means, and then what would happen if there were regulatory changes or model changes there, specifically so that we can understand where any work that we're doing today is or is not going to have a positive outcome in the future if any of this model is adjusted. So you can see here, we already talked about this. We've got our different process maturity levels. We're just pointing out here that at level 2, it's really split into 2 topics, which is documented policies and documented processes. So again, this is just the model's own description of how these are designed to work. Now, when we get into this, we've got another module slide there. Here we go. So a lot of organizations read the process maturity requirements in CMMC and they say, oh, this is new. This is a newly introduced regulatory burden. No one was ever telling me that I needed to have documented policies or documented processes. No one ever told me I had to write anything down. This is a huge uplift on my part. Maybe the organization had just been coming up with their SPRS score using kind of like gut feel determinations. Pretty sure we're doing this. I've seen that in action before. So now when we have these conversations about process maturity requirements, we're saying, whoa, this is net new activities that I have to undergo. And I would encourage organizations to look at what is actually written into their original contractual obligations. Just forget about CMMC for a second. Let's completely set that aside and let's go back to the source. NIST Special Publication 800-171. We already talked about it this morning. It's the definition of adequate security for systems that you, the contractor, own and operate. Now, if you go into the back of NIST 800-171, the final appendix that's in that document is something called tailoring criteria. This is where you understand how the sausage gets made. When NIST 800-171 was drafted and released, NIST had to be super careful because under the FSMA program, NIST isn't allowed to just come up with arbitrary requirements. They have to be a boiling down of original security controls that are already in a FIPS 199 baseline. If you're not familiar with any of that, I won't bore you with the details. Just know that federal systems are given a designation or impact rating for confidentiality, for integrity, and for availability, CIA. It's called the CIA triad. And you're either going to be given a low, a moderate, or a high impact level for each of those values. So when you're going to build a baseline on the federal side for protecting systems, you pick a baseline of controls that matches the impact level. So the big security catalog of controls that exists out there is called NIST 853. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of security controls available to choose from. Baselines are a way to package those into set bundles based on your low, mid, high rating for each of the CIA values. So based on that, NIST had no choice but to leverage those baselines of controls to build the requirements that they put into NIST 800-171. Now, why is that important to understand? Well, NIST was under a lot of pressure to create simple and concise documentation in the form of these 110 requirements that are in 800-171. And so they had to make some sacrifices in what they choose to add detail to. So the decision process that they went through is, hey, we don't have time to describe an everyday information security program in NIST 800-171. So we're going to go ahead and set forth some assumptions that everyone should have in their mind when they pick up NIST 800-171 for the first time. And the first thing we want to set forth as an assumption as NIST is that there are certain security controls that are just so darn obvious and necessary in order to secure systems and your organization, we don't even have to tell you about them. They're just self-evident, which is kind of a not cool thing to do for NIST when we're talking about the needs of small businesses who probably don't already have an information security program and haven't just had these light bulb moments of self-realization where you say, oh my gosh, you're right, that is totally obvious, I needed that. So what they did is they took all of the security controls that they felt were just completely obvious, on the nose, things you should already have and do, and they buried them away by saying, we're not saying you don't have to do these, we're saying we expect them to already be in place. We don't even have to talk about them. So again, NIST in Appendix E of 800-171, they said these are the controls that are expected to be routinely satisfied by all organizations who are non-federal without any specification needed. You have them, right? Yeah, you have them. Okay, next topic. Here's the requirements for CUI safeguarding. So what we have is buried underneath 800-171 and its 110 requirements. We have these things called NFO controls, non-federal organization controls. That is where policy and procedure lives. Every single family of NIST security controls begins with the very first control being policies and procedures. Now, if we want to look at what those look like, you can see here, this is just a sampling, to fit on one slide of all of the different controls. They always end with a -1. They're the first control in every family of all of the security families, and it's that you have policies and procedures. And again, NIST is saying those should already exist. Now you work on the actual requirements that stack on top of that from a CUI safeguarding perspective. This is a huge surprise for a lot of organizations because they didn't see this hiding in plain sight back in the tailoring criteria and appendices for all of the NIST requirements. So real quick, let's just explain how these specific components or controls that are in the NFO controls are designed to directly satisfy the NIST process maturity requirements. So this is a little hard to see probably if you're sitting towards the back, but on the left-hand side, we have an example of the policy and procedures control. That's AC1 for access control. You can see that you've got all this language saying like, hey, the organization develops and documents access control policies and access control procedures. Those procedures need to include certain content, and so you're going to include that content. You're also going to specify roles and responsibilities, purpose, scope, all these other things. Now, if you've been mostly camping out in CMMC model documents for the last several months, these are going to sound really familiar to you. On the right-hand side, you can see what are called the process maturity objectives for the CMMC model. So if I'm going to get assessed under the CMMC model at some point in the future, everything that's on the right is what I get graded on. I either do or do not have each of those objectives met in that domain area, and that is what determines my pass-fail outcome for my entire assessment. So for the process side of the house, you can see that all of the things that are being described on CMMC process maturity objectives are also described in the policy and procedure controls. One quick caveat, in order to really put it all together, you do need to bring in additional descriptions from the latest version of NIST 853, revision 5, because it talks about taking regulatory and compliance considerations into account when you write those policies and procedures. That's a process maturity requirement in CMMC. So just know that This isn't reinventing the wheel. When the CMMC model came out with all of those process maturity requirements, they're effectively just reading from 853 and saying, you're going to need that, you're going to need that, also that, and don't forget that. That's all those process maturity requirements are. There's nothing novel or innovative happening there. And because 800-171 just assumes that these are in place without requiring any specification, it sneaks up on a lot of contractors, because when you go into, and sorry, I'll show you real quick here, these are the procedure process objectives. So again, at level 2, we've got documented policies, and we've got documented processes or procedures. The 998 process objectives are for procedures. You can see those mapped there in the same base control. So the reason that this is important is because when you are assessed in the future, it doesn't matter if this is a CMMC assessment. It doesn't matter if this is a DoD DCMA assessment like we talked about this morning, just for 800-171. Both of those assessment guides for both of those models use the exact same assessment objectives, which we're talking about here, for practices and requirements. And they also use the exact same assessment methods and objects. So the reason that that is exactly the same between both of these guides is not just for the sake of simplicity and reducing any differences between the two models. It's because these are federally required. This is how you must do the assessment. So the Information Security Oversight Office, ISOO, they issued guidance last year that says any entity that is going to assess any other entity for their ability to safeguard CUI has to follow these steps. You have to use these procedures, you have to use these methods, you have to satisfy these objectives. That's the watermark. You don't get to make up your own assessment methodology. So when the DoD read that, in the process of building the assessment guide for CMMC, they stuck to those exact same procedures and methods. So when we look at either guide, either NIST 800-171A, which is just for assessing 800-171, that's off to your right here in the blue box, or if you look at the CMMC assessment guide, which is off to your left in that white section, both of them use the exact same objectives and assessment objects. So the reason that I'm pointing all of this out is that every single assessment section that you get into, whether it's a NIST 800-171 practice or whether it's an 800-171 requirement, which is kind of the same thing, they always cite policy and procedures on specific topics as what the assessor examines in order to understand whether you are actually implementing the requirement. So again, these are staring you in the face if you get into the assessment guides themselves. The requirement for policies and the requirement for procedures was never an optional thing. It's expected to be in place, and it's the first thing assessors go to understand your implementation. Any questions on that aspect of process maturity when it comes down to documented policies or documented procedures? Are we good there? Okay, great. So that effectively clears the board for process maturity up through level 2. When we do get into process maturity level 3 for resource planning, when you read those objectives, it's a lot more about the organizational plan itself, how you're going to fund these initiatives, who's going to be tasked with implementation. A lot of those things also already live in policy. So I've seen a lot of organizations when building resource plans for their overall CMMC program, they're not necessarily going to write a resource plan for every domain just to satisfy these process maturity objectives. They're usually going to have an overall CUI safeguarding program. There might be some plans within that, like a contingency plan, an incident response plan, a configuration management plan, some of those common planning documents that you hear talked about in InfoSec programs. But for the most part, they're just going to be taking all of the roles and responsibilities they already took into account in all of their policies and procedures, and they're going to boil those down into one document. Here are all of the responsibility areas. Here's everyone who's involved. Now you know all the human resources. Here's all of the tools we're using. Here's the specific technologies we're using. Here's possible budget line items for that. That's going to be enough to get you through all of the level 3 process maturity. So again, if CMMC doesn't find its way into your business immediately, it's almost immaterial because the documented policy and the documented procedure requirements, they're already there. You've already committed to them since 2016. So we need to start playing catch up on those requirements today. Let's not wait for CMMC assessment to come along to realize we've got major documentation gaps in our program. So everything else that we have spread across the rest of this module is going through the Delta 20 practices that we have in CMMC Level 3. Again, these are newly written practices that were created just for the CMMC model at Level 3. And these don't exist in the original document NIST 800-171 that's already required under DFARS. So when we get into conversations with organizations, sometimes we'll hear this concept of regulatory burden come up. CMMC is a new burden. It's asking me to do new things, and therefore, how do you expect me to pay for this? Totally valid question. Everyone should be asking themselves that question. So what I think would be relevant here is to understand where the CMMC additional practices add new regulatory burden and new work, and where they are simply just a clarifying statement for something you were already committed to. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through these Delta 20 practices and basically look at, if this goes away, what were we already committed to? Is there a major difference there? What are some talking points? So when we think about the Delta 20 practices that are in the CMMC model, basically, the Carnegie Mellon and the SEI team at Carnegie Mellon, who were contracted by the DoD to write the CMMC model, they gave us basically 4 groupings for why they came up with these Delta 20 practices, what their rationale was. You can see here, it's either a foundational practice that's just a clarification of something you are already going to be doing under 800-171. Those are called foundational practices. Next, we've got things related to situational awareness. So these are going to be more related to making better decisions by having better inputs into your cybersecurity program. You can see here the next grouping is phishing, ransomware, and malware. These are just the common threats that most businesses face. Because NIST 800-171 was written more as a data privacy model around CUI, it's not as focused on imminent threats to your business. These are an attempt by the authors of the model to introduce a little more detail around those topics for the preservation of your business. And then finally, we have a grouping that's just for email-based threats, which for most organizations is the #1 inroad for attackers to get into a business. So when we get into these groupings, we're just going to run through this first grouping here. We'll take a little break, we'll stretch our legs, then we'll come back and finish out with the rest of these. When we get into the foundational practices, again, keep in mind, these were originally written to be no-cost, further explanation practices that just expound on something we're already supposed to be doing. So we should keep an eye out for anything that adds cost. So, and this is interactive here. If someone's got a question on, won't that force me to do this? Won't this require me to do that? Let's talk about it. There's no point in me just being up here and rattling off things that I think are true. I'd love to get some real feedback on this. So if you've got a question or a comment or a statement on any of these as we go through them, we should workshop through that together. Just so that you get everything you need out of the discussion. So when we get into these foundational practices, the first one we're going to come across is a newly created domain in the CMMC model called asset management. And strangely, you think asset management, you're probably thinking things like, am I caring for my multifunction printers and my laptops, and am I managing a secure life cycle for systems? Strangely, we get into asset management and there's only one practice, and it has nothing to do with assets in the way that we would think of from a technology asset perspective. What it's more focused on are information assets. So the practice that was added here is that the organization simply defines procedures for how you're going to handle CUI data. That's it. That's the practice. In fact, this practice only has one practice objective, which is that the procedures are defined. So it's a very flat practice. There's not a lot of additional detail there. So what we did is we went back to the source. We looked through blogs and explainer documents for the authors of the CMMC model to see what their reasons were for creating these practices. Here's what they had to say. The CMMC, as in the model itself, is fundamentally about the protection of data. 800-171 has some requirements for the protection of CUI. However, these are often indirect. So they then go on to give some examples here of how media protection is very well represented in NIST 800-171. But they're saying that basically they want to make sure that you've got procedures for the overall handling of sensitive data, regardless of what media form it happens to be in. So at the end of the day, they're trying to expand our discussion here into what does a complete life cycle for data look like from beginning to end, from creation to storage to processing to sharing with other entities, all of that. So let's just simulate for a second. If this practice, along with all of the other Delta 20 practices, was somehow to be trimmed by the DoD because they consider it to be too much of a regulatory burden or whatever it might be, you know, what would be left over if this was to go away? So if we instead look at what would happen if this practice was never written, here's what we would already have in place from a CUI handling procedure set of requirements. Now, all of these requirements are from NIST 800-171 proper, so we're not drawing from any other sources here. Through some of these other discussions, we will draw from other sources, but you can see here that we already have requirements that have to do with how you interact with CUI. So you can see here, we already have to make individuals aware. We've got someone's ship is coming in, that's all I know. So for the first requirement that we have here, we have to make individuals that are in workspaces or logging into computers aware that CUI is present, and those privacy and security notices always include additional detail about how you're supposed to interact with that system. So I'm already being informed of CUI handling procedures just by reading the system use notification when I log in, or by looking at it posted in a controlled environment. So that was already something that we were required to draft and write up. So because of that, we would need to go through and identify what are the handling procedures we're going to write into that notice. We also already, and this is huge for CUI handling, we have to control how data flows from one system to another, from one department to another, from one organization to another. This is at the core of CUI handling. Ultimately, once a system starts to store CUI and it's being processed there, that's a pretty contained situation. But once we create environments where, you know, through source and destination rules on a firewall, or through the decision to publish a sharing link to a file through OneDrive or whatever it may be, we're now flowing information into a new processing environment, maybe even into another business. And so we need to have set rules around that. If your organization isn't reading the practice objectives that are in the information flow control requirement in 800-171 and saying, okay, I need defined information flow control policies, that's an objective for that particular requirement. I need to identify the mechanisms I'm going to use to enforce information flow control in my organization. Am I going to do it through training and administrative controls? Am I going to do it through technology, data loss prevention tools? What is my tool set that I'm going to use to manage these information flow control policies that I've drafted? And then from there, I have to figure out my source and destination designations. Now, that's easy to do on a firewall. It's really hard to do between organizations. When I think about, I'm going to send CUI to a subcontractor, that is an information flow. What is my policy? We already know we have some things in paragraph M that dictate things we have to do around that information flow, contractual obligation flow downs, all of that. What else do I need to think about? Do I need to have security terms and conditions with that entity? If I'm going to set up a brand new system connection, then I'm going to get into some of these other requirements that we have to control these external system connections for that free-flowing data. I probably have to have terms and conditions in place, or an interconnection security agreement, or an MOU, or something like that. All of those mechanisms need to be figured out, and the to and from information, source and destination information, also needs to be all laid out. Then the next objective for information flow is we have to actually have someone sign off on that information flow. So we actually have to have an approved authorization, probably from management, and then, only then, do we move on to actually enforcing those data flows through whatever mechanisms we had already identified. And so that is a set of steps that's already baked into 800-171, that if we're not doing that now, we're not going to have CUI handling procedures. So a lot of these things that we see, even running down through media protection here, how we handle things that are on paper versus on digital media, those are all part of that wider topic of how do I handle CUI in the business. So really all that we're seeing here is that the 036 practice just encourages us to add documented procedures wherever CUI handling takes place, even when it doesn't intersect with one of these existing requirements. So the next CMMC practice that we have here that was newly added is the 044 practice that we're going to review audit logs. Now, the first thing that happens when you talk to someone who's been reading the models a lot, they're like, wait, this was already in 800-171. I had a requirement to review audited events. Why is this being written? Why is this being added? And one of the reasons that this is being added is because the other requirement we're talking about for reviewing audited events has nothing to do with looking at your logs and figuring out if things that shouldn't be happening on the system are happening. That original requirement was that you review the actual audited events, which is a way of saying, I already captured these log types in my systems and shipped them somewhere for review. Do I need to be adding any additional logged events that give me better insight into what's happening in the environment? And then secondarily, do I have logged events that I'm generating that create a ton of noise in the system and I can't actually use it for anything purposeful, or it's a huge resource commit? So I'm actually going to take those logged events away and simplify my view of what's happening in the systems. So when the DoD sat down and read all of these requirements, they realized, wait, we don't actually have any requirement for people that are capturing logs, generating them, correlating them, building audit reduction and report generation capabilities. There's nothing that actually says you actually have to read the darn logs. Nothing. So this is an attempt by DoD to patch back over that. Now, it's safe to say that if we were to take this away, we would still find a lot of existing requirements that actually still mandate the review of logs. You can see here as a few examples. We already have multiple 800-171 requirements that we actually, first and foremost, identify the logs needed and start generating them. That we then correlate those logs with each other. So I've got a log from the firewall, I've got a log from my workstation, I've got a log from a server. Those are all time-stamped, and I can see what's happening broadly across the environment by correlating those with each other. And that we also have the ability to pull reports and run log queries and all these other things. So I can say, show me all the times that's happened in the last 24 hours, and I can look at that data all in one pane of glass. What a lot of organizations don't take into account is that the biggest thing driving their requirement to do log reviews today is actually their DFARS requirements. So we talked this morning about how if I've got a cloud environment, I have to be equivalent to something called the FedRAMP moderate baseline. Well, the FedRAMP moderate baseline is a large catalog of controls. The AU6 control from the FedRAMP moderate baseline is that I have to actually review and analyze my logs to see if there's anything untoward happening in the system, any suspicious activity, any indicators of compromise, you name it. And you can see here that the actual FedRAMP requirement is that I do that every week, minimum frequency. So if I'm going to be equivalent to FedRAMP moderate, I have to go into my cloud provider's customer responsibility matrix and see if I still have to do that activity. So I have an example here for you. I hope Microsoft doesn't mind that I did this, but I did take their customer responsibility matrix statement out of the AU6 control to show what they say subscribers of their system need to do. And you can see here that it does still require that you do reviews and analysis of audit records at least weekly. So hey, it turns out, even though Microsoft is giving me all the logs that I need, I still have to go in and look at them as an operator of the system environment. If you're not a big Microsoft subscriber, here's the same thing in AWS GovCloud. So again, I'm required to review audit records for, based on the desire to find unusual activity or inappropriate activity in the system, and that's still an outstanding requirement for me. So if I'm doing anything in the cloud, this is already a requirement. CMMC is just simply pointing it out. Next, we have in our foundational practices here, the requirement to detect and report events. You can see here that there's some pretty solid rationale laid out here by the CMMC model authors for why they felt the need to write this requirement. And the reason for that is that everything else in the 800-171 requirements is all about incidents. So I actually have something that shouldn't have happened that is maybe leading to a compromise of CUI taking place in the system. But what about everything that happens leading up to an incident kicking off? There's plenty of other things happening in the environment that don't necessarily represent malicious activity or could be something that's indicating something could happen very quickly if I don't act. Those are what we call events. Anything that can be logged or observed in the system is an event. Not all events are incidents. So this is a requirement for organizations to be able to detect events happening in the system, almost always through logs, which we've talked about, but then to be able to report events to see if that suspicious event is indeed an actual incident. So if we don't have that reporting flow built out, we're going to either find out about incidents after they could have been prevented or far later than we would like to from a reporting perspective, also from a containment perspective. So if we were to take away the 093 practice, basically we would simply have our existing detection requirements, which is basically that we need to be able to detect potential incidents so that we can then analyze and contain them and do all the other things that happens in incident handling. And then we would need to do system monitoring to be able to detect not only real attacks, those would be your incidents, right? But then also indicators of potential attacks, so not yet an incident. That's where events can be valuable before we actually get into incident territory. So I believe this is the last foundational practice that we've got. The 094 practice is that we do analysis and triage of events, right, pre-incident occurrences in the system to then support any event resolution or actually declare it as an incident. So events are either one of two things, right? They're either a false positive or something you weren't expecting to happen, but it isn't really the problem we thought it was, or we actually have a security incident. Someone's actively violating security policy, somebody's pulling data out of the system where they shouldn't, I've got malware, I've got whatever happening. That's a real incident. That's when I need to then escalate that into my incident handling capability. So again, this is just trying to chain together all of our existing requirements that are in 800-171 and say, hey, you missed a step right here. The moment where you actually figure out that something's worth declaring as an incident, we don't have a process for that in 800-171. It's a necessary step to be taken for you to even have the ability to activate your incident handling capability. So let's just call it out for what it is. Say that it needs to exist. Let's link those chains together and create more clarity in the process. Now, if we were to get rid of the 094 practice, we really, would just, again, go back to the analysis requirements that we have in our incident handling. That's really not as robust as what we see in the 094 practice, which is the ability to do prioritization or categorization of particular events that we're seeing in the environment. But one thing I did want to point out is that at the core of DFAR 7012 is this idea of a compromise. So if you're not familiar with this definition, a compromise is basically any time you're going to have an impact towards covered defense information that is going to result in a reportable incident to DC3. And you can see here that the examples that were given, if information is disclosed to the wrong person, if you violate the security policy in the system, if you commit any kind of disclosure like posting something to a public website that you shouldn't have, if somebody messes with the CUI itself, if they destroy it or modify it. If you're not familiar with the way ransomware works, ransomware is successful by modifying files and data. making them non-usable. This would be an example of that. And then, of course, any copying of information to unauthorized media. So if someone is exfiltrating data or they're simply putting it on the wrong thumb drive internally, all of those things represent a compromise to cover defense information. So just as a natural outcome of knowing that these are the conditions under which I would need to report an incident, I need to, out of necessity, be able to analyze events that are happening to see if they match the definition of a compromise. Otherwise, I either am going to end up over-reporting things that aren't really compromises because I have no way to analyze or triage them, or I'm not going to report enough of them, which is its own set of liabilities that we'll let the Department of Justice explain to you with their recent False Claims Act announcement. So from that perspective, we can see that behind a lot of these foundational CMMC practices, we've already got existing requirements. We do have, another practice here at the foundational level. This has to do with having predefined procedures for how to respond to declared incidents. If you've ever been in a major cybersecurity incident, you know that that is not the best time to make clear, rational, grounded decisions about what to do next. There's the old axiom that we don't rise to the level of the challenge, we fall to the level of our training. That absolutely holds true in an incident response scenario. In fact, I believe it was Microsoft and Ernst Young did a huge report on this where they identified that any organization who uses the same people to respond to incidents as to be their system administrators, their attacker dwell time and their incident response to full closeout, like no longer an incident, is 3 times longer. And the reason for that is because you've got the same people trying to figure out what the heck's going on, trying to figure out how the heck to fix it. And that's a necessary distribution of labor that you should really push into different work areas. The way you do that is through predefined procedures. So you can see here that some of the rationale behind this is that the more documented these procedures are, the more time you're going to save in getting to closure of that incident. So if this were to go away, we don't really have this sort of intuitive specificity in NIST 800-171 itself. However, we do have already in DFAR 7012 in our rapid reporting and damage assessment paragraphs predefined procedures for incident response. So gosh, it's like CMMC is just telling us what time it is using our own watch. So we see here that in paragraph C and in paragraph E, we've got 2 sets of requirements. They already lay out exactly what we have to pull together from an from an evidence perspective, what sort of analysis we have to do, and then how we're going to stage those reports to the DoD, and then how we're going to support them with the collected evidence during DoD damage assessments. So if you were to go on DibNet like we talked about this morning, and look at the incident response sheet you're supposed to fill out and all the minimum data fields that you've got to fill out, that is a predefined procedure. Complete this information. You're probably going to need procedures on how to get that information to put it onto the document. So that should be your first starting point. So let's not get too creative here. Let's not build crazy Venn diagrams and org charts and like these bespoke processes that only make sense to our organization. Just start with the incident reporting checklist that's already on DibNet and just say, how would I get that piece of information? Write down how you would get that piece of information, and now you've got a predefined procedure. Compare it against 7012, paragraph C through G. Make sure you're hitting all your check boxes there. And now you've got a nice playbook that you can start to iterate on and tabletop through to figure out how you're going to meet those requirements. Again, these are all existing benchmarks for how you're supposed to perform during an incident. So let's meet those requirements, and along the way, we just happen to satisfy these additional CMMC practices. We do have another foundational practice here, which is to implement a policy restricting the publication of CUI on externally owned, publicly accessible websites. And then we're given some specific examples here. So LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. This one was a little confusing for me when I first read the model, because I was thinking to myself, don't we already have this requirement in 800-171, like the exact requirement? And we do. So 3.1.22 out of 80171 says that we have to control information posted to or processed on any publicly accessible information system. So let me ask you, is LinkedIn publicly accessible? Is Twitter publicly accessible? Are any social media platforms publicly accessible? Yes, they are. So all the DoD was doing here is they were looking to establish that you understand that social media is a particular area where people don't exercise good decision making, and they post things they shouldn't, whether they're trying to brag about their company's capabilities or whatever it may be. I can't even make this up. I was on LinkedIn yesterday, and I saw a defense contractor saying, you really can't grasp the magnitude of how big this helicopter rotor is unless you strip all the cowling and shrouds off of the top of the helicopter and you put someone next to it who works for us to show you how big this is. And it's a picture of an employee, of the maintenance person on this helicopter standing next to the rotor, person for reference, with all of the protective shrouds removed and everything exposed, saying, look how huge this is. Like that, I hope for their sake that all of the rotor systems on that particular helicopter have been in service for so long that they're no longer a defense article. But what are you doing? I mean, these are the examples where people are so excited about their capabilities as a contractor, they don't take the time to think about the sensitivity of what they're posting. And these are the situations that the DoD is trying to manage. So they took the extra time to write what I would consider to be a very redundant practice in the CMMC model and added that as an oh, by the way, to stack on top of the more broad requirement we already had, which is to control anything that we post publicly. So I would also just go back to the fact that in the definition of a compromise, we've got unauthorized disclosure, which this would definitely qualify as. So with that, we're going to take just a 10-minute break, and when we come back, we're going to run through the next three types of practices that were added on to the Delta 20 and the rest of the CMMC model. We're going to see how much existing requirements we would have, even if those Delta 20 were trimmed down or went away for some reason, and then use that as sort of a jumping off point to answer any questions we might have or anything like that. So